Welcome to Filth, the Complete Edition. Filth was a web series that I put together about scandal, intrigue, sordidness, dirtiness, and everything vaguely filthy. This is every single episode of the show from 2019 to 2021 that was released and made public. The show is of course nearly 5-6 years old, and has definitely aged better in some places than others. The research is largely still pretty solid, I think. Though, of course, watching them back, I still think, I could have gone into more depth here and not bothered with this. It was an important blueprint for the projects I wanted to go on to do afterwards. I wouldn't take back making it for the world. So, speaking of the world, you get to now enjoy it. Here's every single episode, but not quite in the right order. You see, I'm putting the best looking ones first, and the worst looking earlier ones last. Take it as a bit of an endurance test. Anyway, thank you for sticking around for so long, and I hope you enjoy this feature presentation.
So, we've covered Soviet repression a fair bit on this show before, largely because there's lots of it and not a lot of people know about it. Also, YouTube gets very pissy if you talk about the other famous dictatorship of the 20th century. But I think we need some balance on this show, so let's talk about what I think was one of the coolest bits of resistance to the Nazis: the anarchic, working class, jazz-loving, sex-having, fash-bashing Edelweiss Pirates. Now if that's not squad goals, I don't know what is. The year is 1934, and Germany's got itself into a bit of a mess. There was this guy called Adolf Hitler, and he was a little bit of a terrible human being. After not making it as an artist, he eventually decided he would make it into politics. And his idea of politics was insane, idiosyncratic dictatorship that pinned all of his problems on the current government and also the Jews. After eventually making his way through the ranks by 1933, he was effectively in total control of Germany as the Chancellor. But when President and blimp expert Hindenburg died in 1934, he was in total control. And his control was total. He wanted to engineer every part of a German citizen's life to fit in line with what the party wanted. So of course this meant the education system and young people were very heavily indoctrinated. Girls were kept away from boys and taught how to manage a home and look after children. And the boys were taught real subjects like maths. Except the questions always tended to have a bit of anti-Semitism thrown in to sex it up for little fascists. This also extended to what they did in their spare time too. Girls had their own guides-like group just for womanly things like sewing and knitting and child-rearing, and the boys were forced into the Hitler Youth.
The Hitler Youth was exactly what you would expect.
All the Nazi-approved fun activities, so pogroms, book burnings, and getting off about how great Germany is. The Nazis also banned a lot of the earlier youth groups that were quite popular in Weimar Germany, like the German Scouts or the German Youth Movement. Some kids, naturally, thought this was all bollocks. The Nazis were bollocks. Hitler was bollocks. Their control on culture was bollocks. Their anti-Semitism was bollocks. They wanted an out. And also some of them wanted to take a bit of revenge too. In 1938, the earliest Edelweiss Piraten group started to emerge, named after the Edelweiss flower. Their goal was simple: have fun and think freely.
Oh, and they were also really into camping as well.
For this to work, a lot of their members actually dropped out of school at 14, so they couldn't be tracked easily by the Nazis, and used this schoolless time to have a bit of fun before they go into work. Unfortunately, usually this would mean only a few years of freedom, especially as conscription existed to round these guys up at 18, and as I alluded to earlier, a lot of its members were working class kids and they couldn't really get out of it. The system wasn't amazingly concerned about them either, at least to begin with, so in this capacity the pirate groups all across Germany did what they could do to have fun. They openly didn't care about the Nazi dress code, so they wore their hair long and wore very garish clothes, like ironic lederhosen. They hated the Nazi-approved music system as well, so they listened to jazz and music by Jewish musicians. Already you can tell I like these people a lot. I mean, lederhosen klezmer party, I'm there. They also encouraged boys and girls to hang out together, one of the few times that this actually happened under the Nazi regime. So no prizes for guessing what they got up to. As well as that, they tried to keep the original scouting traditions alive that Hitler had banned, including the use of this uniquely German tent. It's pretty German. Now, you're probably wondering, where's the pictures? Well, they were deeply underground and very poor. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of them out there. In fact, there's not a lot of records of what they exactly did, which is why it's important to preserve what we do know. And what we do know is that by the time the war had started, they began to move from passive resistance to the regime to open, brilliant antagonism. There's a lot of petty resistance in there, like pouring sugar into Nazi officer cars and random bits of vandalism, and also during the war distributing Allied leaflets. But they also did a lot more actively aggressive stuff, and, you know, it's the Nazis too bloody right. If they came into contact with the Hitler Youth Policing Squad, the Streifendienst, they would beat the shit out of them. They also raided Nazi army bases for munitions, helped Jews escape the country, and according to a couple of sources I read, straight up assassinated the head of the Cologne Gestapo. The Edelweiss groups had thousands of members, with at least 3,000 in Cologne alone, and as a result they really did begin to rattle the Nazis. And particularly of note is that they were apolitical. They didn't know anything about Marxism or liberalism or the West. All they knew was Nazi propaganda their entire lives. Remember, during the war, all of these people would have been born and raised entirely in Nazi Germany. You don't need to know of the enemy when the world you live in is bad enough. You can and will rise up against your cruddy regime. As you can imagine, when the Nazis did start to care about this, the punishments were swift and severe. They started with similar tactics to the Soviets, dealing with the Stilyagi, like haircutting and public shaming. But then it all started to take a very Nazi turn. In my own research, I found at least a dozen teenagers who were executed for their part in Edelweiss activities.
One of the more high-profile cases was that of Barton Schenk. Along with a few other German teenagers, he was arrested in early 1944. For the next several months, he was tortured and detained without trial. Eventually, he was hanged in late 1944, all because he was a member of the Pirates.
But their sacrifices for the resistance were not in vain. Eventually, of course, Germany lost the war, and the Edelweiss people continued for a little while after the end of the war. Unfortunately, though, unlike a lot of other resistance groups, they weren't the biggest fan of the Allies, nor was the reverse true either. The Edelweiss Pirates, frankly put, weren't interested in another system. They just wanted to be free to do what they wanted and how they felt, which doesn't really gel with market capitalism, or authoritarian socialism. So yeah, they were quashed in every way you can imagine, and not really remembered very well.
It's important to note that neither the Soviets nor the Allies thought the Edelweiss Pirates were completely useless. In fact, on a few occasions, the Soviets did actually try and recruit Edelweiss pirate members, though whether they had any takers is unfortunately very unclear. Also remember that the Edelweiss groups were fairly anarchic in nature. No two branches were the same. It was a name that encompassed a lot of different beliefs, some of them leaning more towards the Allies, some of them leaning more towards the Soviets, and some of them leaning towards nothing other than more camping now!
I mean, the German city of Cologne, which as I mentioned was one of the biggest places for the pirates, only recognised their existence and role in the resistance in 2005. But, you know, it's not all bad. For example, I heard about them in GCSE history, and while it wasn't something we studied in any great detail, the fact that their name was said as the only listed resistance group in the topic says a lot about how we really should be seeing them and how they're treated today. I think even if they're rough around the edges, they were the quintessential youth resistance to the authoritarian regime. They had style, they had ideas, they spooked the regime that's much bigger than them, and crucially, they didn't really have a long-term plan. They existed to exist. At no point were the pirates actively thinking, wow, let's overthrow the system, because they knew that wasn't possible. But they did know they could chip away its authority, piece by piece. Before we leave, I thought it'd be nice to acknowledge some of the art that they did as well. This is Es war in Shanghai, a popular campfire song sung by the Pirates and written by Yin Yilik, an Edelweiss pirate who was also on trial with Schenk. And I think the song puts a lot of the feelings the pirates had in one place. It's a song about travel, moving quickly from place to place, never staying in one spot too long and being free to do as you feel. And if that isn't something to look up to, then really what is? Remember the 5th of November. Yes, it's anonymous and V for Vendetta Day, everyone. But why him? Who the Fawkes is this guy? And why do we care about him? In 1605, he single-handedly tried and failed to blow up Parliament. Except you know he didn't, and here's the real story. The year's 1604, and there's a guy who really doesn't like the king. His name's Robert Catesby. Catesby was a Roman Catholic, and to put it rather delicately, they'd not really been treated very well by the Protestants. Now, that's one massive oversimplification, but suffice it to say, even if you're a rich and well-connected member of the English gentry, like Catesby, you'd still run into a lot of problems for being a Catholic. England, of course, had broken away from the Catholic Church in the 16th century, starting with the separation of the churches under Henry VIII, and becoming actually Protestant during the reigns of Edward VI and Elizabeth I, give or take a few years where that Bloody Mary was in charge. And of course, how do you enforce the beliefs that you hold in the medieval period? Well, it's pretty easy, isn't it? Just punish the opposition for merely existing. So the Catholic population of England found themselves the biggest enemy and the most hated minority of the time. I should clarify that at this time all the usual targets were still banned from entering the country. Catesby was quite a big supporter of the underground Catholic cause, funding Jesuit priests out of his own pockets and giving financial and actual real-world assistance to other rebellions before the Gunpowder Plot. But they're not as famous or as interesting. After Elizabeth died and James VI of Scotland became James I of England, Catesby was not impressed by his efforts to free the Catholics, or lack thereof. Even though James was the son of quite famous Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, James had become irrationally angry with the Vatican in recent times. For example, the Pope once sent James's wife a set of rosary beads. Pretty nice gesture from someone who's not even part of your church. James responded by exiling every Catholic priest in the country. Catesby saw all of this going on and decided, right, I need to take matters into my own hands. Again. And so he set out on his plan to destroy the House of Lords. He ideally wanted to take out James, his heir at the time Henry, and some other important Protestant officials that history doesn't really care about. However, his plan would almost certainly take out a lot of Catholic lords too, which he reasoned as being fine because they were actually atheists, fools and cowards. His words, not mine. So, off to a great start then, killing your cause. After telling his cousin and getting him on board, he needed more recruits. So over the next few months he recruited a few dozen members, all knowing increasingly less about the plot, into the fold. He also hired this rather unknown guy from York fighting for the Spanish in the Netherlands who specialised in gunpowder, a Guido Fawkes. Who's he? That's sort of important. He was deliberately no one. They wanted someone part of the gang who didn't really have any connection to anything. No one really had any opinion about him, which made him the perfect guy to be part of the plan. Somehow they were going to get into the House of Lords and blow them all away. And it wouldn't take too much gunpowder either. The House of Lords at the time was pretty small and quite cramped. Everything was sort of going to plan, and by the time Parliament would reopen in February, they'd have figured out how to do it too. Then the plague happened. A plague outbreak in the early months of 1605 prorogued Parliament for 9 months. So their new starting point was now October. Okay, great, more time to cock it up. Here's how they did it. So first up, the stuff that they got sorted correctly. They managed to procure lots and lots of gunpowder. Actually, probably too much gunpowder, but I guess they wanted to be really sure. Well, there's reports of the group digging tunnels into Parliament, and that's always the folklore story that you get told at school. There's not a great deal of evidence to support that they actually did it. What they did do, however, is rent an office in the underhalls of the House of Lords building. Apparently that was for sale back then, and because no one was checking what was going in, they stored all of their gunpowder undetected in that office. They'd also been working with a few other members of the English gentry, however no one that important. We're talking upper middle class, not upper class here. Catesby and friends also wanted a Catholic revolution across the country, so they tried to find sleeper cells across the Midlands to do his bidding and start a revolt. These little groups were instructed to rise up the second they heard that the king had fallen. Okay, so far so guerrilla. How did they screw this up? Well, for someone chastising others as a fool and a coward, it might not be the wisest idea to repeatedly hint at your ideas in confessionals and then run away suspiciously when your name gets bandied about when it all goes tits up. Just a thought. On multiple occasions, he'd confessed he wouldn't mind killing innocents for the greater good, each time with more specifics about his gunpowder plot than the last. He really couldn't bloody help himself. Oh, and probably the most damning thing, despite the fact that Catholics were ridiculously oppressed in the country, the majority of Catholics not only liked James, but when they heard about it, disapproved of the plot. And the Catholic Church explicitly condemned such an act too. So the people you're doing this for think it's terrible. Great job. Somehow, someone sent an anonymous letter to a Catholic MP basically saying, "Something's up, please don't come to Parliament this week." This Catholic MP, not sympathetic to the cause at all. He was trying to get into young James's good books, so he immediately told King James, and long story short, the gunpowder was discovered with some guy looking after it. Imagine how different British history would have been if Catesby and his friends just didn't tell the right people, or if that letter had never been sent, or whatever else. That's the butterfly effect for you, isn't it? We'd have been Catholic. Well, not me or anyone that works on this show, but everyone else we know. Catesby was rounded up and shot a few days after leaving London, after the plot had been discovered. That guy we mentioned knew very little about what was going on, so the government tortured him until he knew slightly more than little. From there, they got the names of the other conspirators and did some locking up. It was serialised, an act made it a service in the Anglican tradition, commemorating the fact that they'd caught these guys, and it was kept in the public consciousness in one way or another. Especially as the decades wore on, the Catholic-Protestant debate continued, as did the holiday. Though of course today you'd be hard pressed to find anyone thinking this is some sort of sectarian event. Today it's more just weird tradition about Parliament rather than anything to do with Catholics or Protestants, especially in Sussex, specifically the town of Lewes, where they also burn crosses. Oh, it's not looking so hot, is it? I just want to clarify, it's really not how it looks. It's to do with Protestant martyrs being killed by Catholics, but burning crosses are just a bit awkward, aren't they? And every year it also gets more and more insane. Like last year there was a big Boris Johnson in Lewes weeing on us from the skies. Please don't give him any more ideas. Anyway, today Guy Fawkes is remembered as being the idiot in the wrong place at the wrong time. If Catesby had kept his mouth shut or vetted his fellow crackpots, I know, easier said than done, but you know what I mean. If he'd not done any of those things, England could have ditched Protestantism, and thus the next 400 years of infighting, squabbling and violence across Europe would have been so very, very different. It would have just been continual wars with the Dutch. Which, come to think of it, we sort of did. Same shit, different day. The biggest responsibility historians have is to interpret what's happened before based on what exists from the past. If you want a reliable starting point, your best bet is how people wrote about it at the time. And this is exactly what I do, like with the Lady Chatterley video, where I bought first one prints of the book and the trial. I do this because accounts from the time don't have the accuracy problems a more modern source will inevitably have. I mean, how many of you remember what I just said verbatim after you finished watching this video? Exactly, now try remembering that in 10 years. These sources are best kept in archives and maintained by archivists. Now, an archive is supposed to be a neutral reflection of what happened. You know that's not going to be the case, is it? Archivists are allegedly human beings like the rest of us, and so they have the same biases and opinions that we all fall victim to. And of course, whoever's paying to keep the lights on, be it a corporate donor or the government, is going to want a little bit of control in return, aren't they? But let's say you're a budding dictator or cynical archivist, or something in the middle. A budding archivist? Ew. So how do you put your mark on world history? Well, today we're going to go through a few of the ways that you can do it. And hopefully by the end of the video you can see why researching can be so bloody difficult.
Make the archives hard to access.
Probably the easiest thing to do, but you can start by making it very difficult to physically access your collection. Now, despite some people's claims, I live in a fairly liberal European country, so if I'm looking for National Archives stuff, I can either look online for archive material, or if it's actually a physical thing at the National Archives, I can quite easily get an appointment to see the more delicate stuff, even if I have to wear one of these bad boys. That was smooth. Sometimes you might need ID, just to make sure you're not a spy or a vandal. This is something to bear in mind. Sometimes old stuff just doesn't get backed up, and it's just very fragile and left in a very fragile way. Sometimes it's not a conspiracy out to get historians. That's boring. Let's talk about times where it's deliberately hard to access. A good recent example is the mainland Chinese Foreign Ministry Archive. Opened up during that weird period in CCP history where things were slightly liberalised, it was then immediately closed when Xi Jinping took office. It was reopened in 2016 with a fraction of the original material, and to access any of it, it's as terrifying as you can probably imagine. As Kazushi Minami describes for the Woodrow Wilson Center, China seems determined to rewrite the past on its own terms, and it all starts in the archives. In order to get into the Foreign Ministry Archive these days, you need ID, a person vouching for you, their ID, and telephone number, a written letter of approval from a Chinese institution, and specific details on what you're researching, like timeframes and countries it involves. Hey, no wonder they're so good at track and trace. Restricting who gets in and how they can see it plays a massive part on how people view your history. I mean, the abilities for independent research are a bit limited when there's someone behind you breathing down your neck whilst you do it. So as a result, if the original sources are controlled, all it really takes is a few second-hand sources before things start to mutate further and further from the truth. But that's one thing. What if you actually start playing with what's there to read? Make everything classified! The easiest and probably most common way of doing this is to just brickwall everything, classify it as being dangerous to national security, even though it obviously really isn't. And I know this might make me sound like a bit of a hypocrite. That sort of thing has to exist. There are some things and plans people shouldn't have access to because it will endanger other people's lives. But sometimes people really do just take the piss. The US and the UK, for example, will still not declassify things from World War I, despite the fact that that conflict was over a century ago and everyone that was involved in it is pretty dead at this point. Now, in 1920, fair enough, lock up all the stuff that is dangerous and you've still not really changed. In 2020, you haven't really got much of an excuse. Stuff like this can actually really mess with how we understand history unfolding, which some would argue is sort of the point of why they do it. It can hide things that don't really fit the official narrative. Thankfully, a lot of this is actually cleared up with things called Freedom of Information Acts. If you ask the government very nicely, and through a lot of bureaucracy and stuff, you can usually get the answers you want. Okay, but what if you don't want to deny stuff, but just spin what's in your archives? Step 3. Release what you want out there. Rather than making, let's say, everything you have public, you can drip feed stuff in a way to make one side of the fight look really, really bad. Especially if you're also really, really bad yourself. The Soviet Krasnaya Archiv is quite a good example of this. Started in 1922 and edited by an actual historian, the archive sought to make the worst bits of the recently overthrown Tsarist regime public knowledge. So as well as publishing important documents that pertain to the success of the newly established Bolsheviks, it also published a lot of old archive material the Tsars of decades past would not have wanted out there. At no point was anything they published forged or falsified, but at the same time, they weren't going to be putting out things that make them look bad. They cherry-picked things they wanted the proletariat to see. And of course the stuff that got put out there just made the Tsars look like right dicks. Obviously, this was great for the Soviets and allowed for the famous Soviet propaganda staple of whataboutism. Yeah, I know we're doing some bad stuff, right? But have you seen these guys? They're on another level. Today, the archive is owned by Eastview, a private archive that primarily focuses on cataloguing old Soviet archive materials. They've also preserved these archives forever, behind a paywall, so I can't really tell you what's in them. But, you know, it's better than nothing. Speaking of private archives, not Eastview though.
We're a corporation. We can do what we want.
It is possible for an archive to be a hostage to its own donors. World War II president and famous set of initials, FDR, was the first US president to create his own presidential library. Being very devilish with the details, create his own presidential library, pretty much completely organised by himself. He assembled a team of historians, politicians and lawyers to create a library out of his writings and books, and after his team had curated it, it would then be put into the public domain and looked after by the US government. Odd conflict of interest there, don't you think? Being able to control your own library about yourself. Might just get rid of some of the bad stuff, you know? Of course, if you've done something completely terrible, you can always pretend that it didn't happen. Like IBM, who under a German subsidiary called Dechemag, deliberately sold machines to the Nazis used for Nazi censuses. You know, the ones that catalogued undesirables and allowed the Holocaust to happen. The writer of the quite famous book IBM and the Holocaust notes that IBM may have purged their archives a little bit of their Nazi collaborators. And if it's your archives, and it's IBM, so you make the machines that process your archives, you can do what you want. So yeah.
Apparently your mum knows a lot about this one.
Now, this last one is going to be a little bit controversial because it's hard to outright call it censorship. It's more than that. It's more of a consequence of a lot of imperialist thought commonplace until, well, it still is. Unfortunately, it is acceptable to many people that cultures that didn't write down their history are to be treated differently, usually inferior, and as a result are not worthy to be archived. Many cultures keep oral accounts of their own history, accounts just as detailed and in many ways a lot more impressively recorded than our own, but historians have generally treated them with skepticism. You know, they're only folklore stories, right? And as a result have only recently started storing them in archives. Especially with the First Nations of North America and many immigrant groups to the Americas. Some of this, admittedly, was a technical limitation. Oral histories until fairly recently could only be written down, and therefore archived, but being transcribed by an outsider can have its rather obvious issues. And that's just ignoring the differences you get when you translate any medium. It's not the same and you will miss understanding. Of course, today, oral histories can now be recorded quite easily, even on your phone. But of course, that ignores the roadblock that some people have of not wanting to do it. And it's America, you can probably imagine why. And that's just a few of the ways you can unfairly change what people think happened. Thanks!
As much as we live in the liberated space age of 2020, there's still a lot of censorship. But there's one type I think you're seeing more of now than you ever did before. Self-censorship.
when the creator of something censors their own work, usually pulling it from distribution and stopping people from seeing it at all. Until recently, scrubbing your own work from existence was extremely costly, not least of all extremely irritating for people who just want to watch it. But like literally everything else, the internet makes this all a lot easier. Before the internet, there's only really a few rare instances of self-censorship like this. One above all stood out to me, and that was a Clockwork Orange.
YouTube's terms of service. Some fannies have been replaced by twats.
A Clockwork Orange is the most disturbing film ever. And I stand by that even now, even though it's been many years since I originally saw it. I actually rewatched it in preparation for this episode, and my judgment still stands. And I've seen plenty of horrible, grim, depressing, dark, morbid films in the interim, and Clockwork Orange is still the king when it comes to uncomfortability. Sure, there's no gory violence in this. This and Texas Chainsaw Massacre are the masterclasses in implication. But the atmosphere built, the feeling you get watching it, and the uncomfortable nature of it all makes it pure horror show. It's also at points extremely quotable and absurdly hilarious.
You know what you can do with that watch? Stick it up your ass!
Good.
Which makes that uneasy feeling even worse, because there are moments in the film that are almost too disturbing to really want to describe.
Food, alright.
This scene being the worst of them all, obviously.
Without spoiling the plot too much, the story follows a teenager called Alex, as he terrorises a seemingly anarchic, visually arresting Great Britain, where he can do what he wants, when he wants, however he wants. There is way more to it than that, and rest assured it's not just grimness for the sake of grimness.
Eventually the film goes from being very violent into being a discussion about violence instead, in a very nuanced way, with some very difficult answers to go along with it. Oh, and this guy who gives one of the best performances ever.
It's beautiful, horrifying, provocative, thought-provoking, and also manages to tie you in as the viewer in some very interesting moral knots.
I think you can probably guess already, but when this was released in 1971, it was a little bit controversial. Shockingly,
The BBFC, the people who cut bits from films over here in England, passed it uncut. This was during a brief period where a lot of boundary-pushing films got through the censoring ringer, in a weird bit of liberalism that we didn't really see again until the turn of the millennium. This decision to let it go uncut resulted in a surprising amount of backlash for the then head of the BBFC, Stephen Murphy, who was targeted by some extremely concerned film producers and distributors who thought that he was single-handedly flushing morality down the toilet. Naturally, when Clockwork came out uncensored, and even the film industry itself were having second thoughts, so did Mary Whitehouse and her army of censorious, coffin-dodging droogs. Naturally, this just encouraged a lot of people to see it that wouldn't have anyway. But then, some crimes started happening. If you're my age, or slightly older, you might remember that people used to come on the news and say that Grand Theft Auto was going to cause kids to kill each other. Essentially, what we're going to talk about today is the same exploitation of tragedy. An onslaught of gang crimes in the early 1970s began to drag A Clockwork Orange's name in the mud, even if almost completely unrelated. Frequently cited ones include gang fights where members of them claim in police interviews that they saw A Clockwork Orange, or their defence lawyers claimed it, after the fact. A murder that happened to take place the same day that Clockwork Orange was being screened somewhere on the other side of the city, and a manslaughter case where it's revealed that the accused boy didn't see the film, but instead read the book a long time before the manslaughter occurred.
understandably, the film's director, Stanley Kubrick, was not happy with how the film was being received.
And so he did the unthinkable. Ban the film where he lived. Which was here in the United Kingdom.
Not any other country, mind you. He doesn't live there, they can just all fall apart.
He was particularly concerned about both these supposed copycat crimes and several threats made towards him and his family. There were pickets outside his country home in Hertfordshire. It was getting pretty serious. Still not a justification for what he did, but just want to put the devil's advocate side out there. Warner Brothers didn't pull it. The government didn't ban it. The BBFC were actually keeping stum and wanted to keep it out there uncensored, which is not very them in the 70s. It was Stanley Kubrick himself, and it stayed banned by Kubrick for the remainder of his life. One of the most popular films of the early 70s, internationally, and here of course, and with one of the most defining performances of a generation, just suddenly wiped and unavailable. This was also way before you could actually own copies in your own home. And even when you could buy any sort of horrible video nasty on VHS, you still couldn't buy A Clockwork Orange. Stanley Kubrick, as I said, pulled it from distribution. You couldn't get it in any way, even as the decades progressed and home video releases became the norm. You couldn't see it in the cinema, and if your cinema showed it or tried to show it, you could risk a massive fine.
In 1993, a cinema in London called The Scala tried to show it and were immediately sued by Kubrick's people.
In the decades that followed, the best you could hope for was an imported video from Europe or a bootleg taping, both of which were hard to come by. It was quite a rare, cool thing to actually have seen it in this country, better yet to even have a copy.
The first time I ever actually saw the film was in the early 1980s. I went to somebody's house and they just got one of the very first video recorders, which at that point was like the size of a small settee. And the first thing that happened was somebody turned up with a pirate copy of Clockwork Orange. And of course, by that point, I mean, I knew the book really well, I knew the music really well, I'd seen the stills on the back of the album, I'd read all the scare stories about how it was this terrible thing. Finally, you were going to get to see it. What we actually saw was a very fudgy, fifth generation, almost entirely orange copy of the video with, I think, Japanese or German subtitles. And even in that terribly degraded state, it seemed to be something exceptional.
Even though the on-screen violence was quickly surpassed by slasher films and the like, it was still stopped for the remaining 26 years of his life. About a week after he died, the Scala Movie Theatre, which had now bounced back, rushed to show it, and by all accounts they did, and good on them. And by 2000, everyone could see it on this home video, which I don't own anymore. So we can now enjoy a bit of the old ultra-violence at home. The idea of it being banned at all is a distant memory now, to people my age anyway. I feel like this story is a great defence for why you should separate art from artist. A Clockwork Orange, 2001, Doctor Strangelove are all flawless masterpieces.
But the ban was petty, pointless and neurotic, and there's no getting out of that.
I'm sorry, but even though you made 2001, this doesn't excuse this bad, damp mark on a largely flawless career. Well, I said largely flawless. Stats are usually extremely boring to me, but at the very least, I do understand that they are important. Not many other social psychologist wannabes do at the moment, so it's good that one of us does. The week that I'm writing this episode, I have the first big statistics exam of my university career, and I'm shitting bricks, I won't lie to you guys. I'm fairly prepared now, but still, I am massively, massively terrified. But this has, at the very least, made me want to explore some of my own statistics, specifically my YouTube analytics. But where's the filth in this, you might ask? Well, later on there's going to be some real dirty analytics. So buckle up and enjoy some newbie YouTuber statistics. Before that though, a little bit about me. Things have changed a lot this year. At the beginning of 2019 I had exactly 3 subscribers and I knew every single one of them. Today I have about 60. Now I know that doesn't sound like a lot, and believe me, I know my place in the world. It's still a lot to me. I don't know every single one of them. There are now people subscribed to my channel that I don't actually know in real life. And that to me is big. So how did we get here? Why am I talking to you now in front of what I can only describe as the best green screen background of human history? And if you disagree, you're wrong. At the start of 2019, I'd only just started uploading videos made for YouTube. I'd been uploading some old stuff I'd made for college before, but around November I actually started giving a damn and making proper YouTube videos. They were all documentaries with archive footage and pictures, sort of a Cribs Note attempt to Adam Curtis's style. And they were well received. The biggest of these two were the Panopticon video and Christmas in Bucharest. 2 videos I'm actually still really happy with when it comes to how they turned out. I tend to think rather critically of this time in my, I guess, YouTube career, but I'm really still proud of these videos. In fact, the Christmas in Bucharest video is still really popular. A couple of weeks ago, it got featured in a Danish newspaper called Berlingske, so, tak. According to the channel analytics, by the way, thanks to the massive bump in views from Berlingske, all of my viewers are Danish boomers, which I cannot help but find hilarious. I made a few others, but eventually I got bored with the format and bored with being so serious. I feel they don't really have my personality either, not that serious documentaries really need to have a personality. So if I wanted to enjoy what I did, I had to change. And that's why about 6 months ago I stood in front of these curtains and did this. Moving their news broadcasts 20 minutes before and 20 minutes after the hour instead. So all the Filth episodes that I made in 2019, which is about 6 published over 3 months, including one that I didn't bother releasing, has had about 500 views, garnering around 20 hours of watch time, and on average people are sticking around for about 3.5 minutes, which as far as I'm concerned is a massive success for a big gamble in format change. Considering this is actually up for my old viewer duration, even for the most popular videos, yeah, I'm chuffed with this, and I'm really, really proud that I can keep with an idea for longer than a couple of weeks, and that people actually want to watch it. So once again, thank you to you guys. Some videos, like the Polari episode, the Profumo affair episode, and the James Ferman episode though, people actually stuck around for longer. After all, they're niche subjects, and people looking for them are going to want to see everything about it, especially if there's not much else out there. Others, on the other hand, like Video Nasties or Lady Chatterley's Lover, on average newcomers actually disappear from. For example, the Lady Chatterley video, in fact, people actually left after about 90 seconds. But then things get sexy. Someone searching for, quote, the trial of Christine Keeler's sex scene, I'm just going to point out, really? Came to one of my videos, stayed and watched the whole thing. That Profumo video is so good that someone trying to get off to sex scenes on YouTube stopped what they were doing and watched my video instead. Well, unless they just changed their material, in which case, great. And now the fun bit. Here are the best search terms that people are looking for.
What you are about to see is the real thing.
Lady Chatterley sexy. Sex scandal. Sex movies. Yeah, you're going to find those on YouTube. XXX scandal. Proper sex videos. Yeah, again, where are you going to find those on YouTube? Sex affair. XXX affair. Profumo sex scene. Sex porn. Just the bluntness. Just the fucking bluntness. Lady Chatterley, spelt wrong, sex video. Cheating affair XXX. And standing 69 porn videos. How did you get this? It just does not make sense. How? Possibly, how does that happen? I have literally no idea. Unbelievable. The sort of things, the sort of filth that people search for on the internet is just unbelievable. So that begs the question, why are there so many turned on viewers? All of the terms that I just showed you have garnered at least a couple of views, and some of them with actually some not bad watch time too. Well, the answer's given away by the last one really, as that's actually a translation that I did. The original term was video bokep 60. It's Indonesian for that. Adult material's actually banned in a lot of countries like Indonesia, to the delight of social conservatives and literally no one else. And let's be real, probably not even them either. And there are some countries where you can not see that, but look at YouTube instead. To my knowledge, Indonesia is one of those. As a result, people are desperate. Extremely desperate. So desperate that they turn up on my videos. This is also whenever a TV show uploads anything slightly intimate onto YouTube, it gets millions of views, usually from people who have never even heard of the show. There is a conclusion to all of this. Even though this is a tiny, tiny show with a not particularly big audience, its success so far is proof that even with today's very neutered YouTube landscape, it's still possible to make something slightly more provocative. This and the combination of covering things that no one else has really talked about really seems to be the ticket for potential success. Let's see if I can keep it up this year. After consecutive videos of breaking my own rule there by talking about extremely popular things and barely getting any views. Yay! You know, it's been quite a while since I've covered some actual history here on YouTube. Well, it's also been quite a while since I've uploaded a video to YouTube as well. 3 words. Lots of deadlines. Lots and lots and lots of deadlines. So let's talk about something historical and something very niche, very much my bread and butter. So here, without further ado, are the Russian hipsters that history has forgotten. The Stilyagi. Stilyagi? One of the ones. When you think of the Soviet Union past World War II, sorry, Great Patriotic War, but pre the death of Stalin, you don't really think of madly dressed teenagers. You just imagine starving people all being bossed about and sent to the gulag. And while that is sadly quite true, some of the young people that had survived the Great Patriotic War wanted to try out some of the Western culture they'd experienced briefly in Europe. While Stalin's time in office had largely been fairly culturally uneventful, the 40s in the Western world had brought about things like swing and big band music, and artists like Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman ruled the world. And by the end of the 40s, Russian teenagers had discovered this music and really gotten into it. They loved Glenn Miller and the film Sun Valley Serenade, which his music features in prominently. And even bigger than the music was the style that went with it. Whatever cool Western stuff they could look at, they would try and copy. Anything that looked a little bit different from the state-issued standard Soviet garb was highly sought after. Using black market goods imported by what were then called the Fartsovka. This is like the third or fourth take where I've not corpsed my way through that line. They could dress how they wanted. They were hunting for style. They were style hunters, or Stilyagi in Russian. I feel like it goes without saying, but not every teen at the time was a Stilyagi, in the same way that there were only a few hundred proper real punks in London during the height of the 70s. It was a small thing, but there was enough for the Soviet government to take notice, but we'll get to that in a minute. They also had their own slang, because of course they did, I'm talking about it. The ones listed on the Russian Wikipedia page are telling of their social attitudes. Lots of stuff on fashion, lots of stuff on sex, and of course at least one term about the domestic products of light industry. One thing that's really great about this story is on Russian Google Images there are tons and tons of Stilyagi pictures, and because it's the Soviet Union during the 50s, copyright didn't exist, so I can show you all of them. Look at these people. They look like they're having fun in the Soviet Union. How? Love that guy especially. I want those sunglasses. I want to look like that one day. Instead, I wear this blue jumper and look like a fool. The Stilyagi were also very into pirating music. In fact, they're probably one of the biggest early efforts of pirating music. In the Soviet Union, you obviously couldn't just buy American records, at least in the late 40s, early 50s. You needed to get it imported, which was costly and dangerous, or pick up some sort of bootleg copy somehow. Get this. Using modified gramophones, underground sound engineers found a way of duplicating vinyl records, like this one, onto used X-ray sheets. That's right, records made out of old X-rays. Anyone who thinks they had it bad with cassette tapes, or worse, only having YouTube for listening to music on, have literally nothing to complain about. That being said, I don't want to downplay how impressive it is to even come up with something like that. I am in awe. It's incredible. And it also went hand in hand with Samizdat, which was this practice of doing basically the same thing, but with books instead. Very tempted to do a whole episode on that, so keep posted. Unlike a lot of teenaged protest groups, there wasn't a political message going along with the Stilyagi. After seeing all the war and the famine and all the horrible stuff that had dominated Stalin's time in charge, they had no ideology. Nothing. Well, I say that. The one thing they had was standing out from the crowd. As you can imagine, Stalin wouldn't have been too keen on this. I couldn't find any evidence to suggest that he knew about it personally, but given his track record, I somehow doubt he'd be a big fan of anyone with an opinion other than his roaming the streets of Leningrad. To be fair, anyone having an opinion would be bad enough. The Soviet Komsomols, which were the Communist Party groups for young people, were asked to put a stop to it. So they started expelling any openly Stilyagi Soviet citizens and kicked them out of uni. Yeah, that's right. Wearing the wrong clothes and looking like this could get you kicked out of a Soviet uni. How lucky do we have it in England? Even worse, they were said to have deliberately attacked groups of them in public, forcibly cutting their hair and ripping up their clothes as a means to discredit them. The Soviet press also ridiculed their desire for Americana. The term Stilyagi is actually a Soviet press invention as well. One famous 50s headline in Pravda read, "Today he plays jazz, tomorrow he sells our homeland." Stalin's government actually did a lot to try and stop people from spreading pesky subversive music. The Stilyagi and the jazz music they listened to were considered part of an American cosmopolitan plot by the authorities that could potentially destroy the Soviet Union. Anyone caught making bone music or playing it in public would usually be sent to prison, and if they weren't ridiculed by the press, they were scrutinised and harassed in public. So all power to them for trying to keep it going. But then rather suddenly, things changed. As you may be aware, Stalin died, and eventually Khrushchev became the new leader of the Soviet Union. As this began to happen, culture began to thaw, which is where some, by no means all bans on media, became relaxed. Definitely nothing controversial or thought-provoking, but jazz was suddenly deemed okay in the Union. Also, fashion became slightly less rigidly enforced, and young people had a bit more choice about what they could wear. Most importantly, thanks to a slight easing on restrictions, they could copy styles from the outside world a bit more easily, and the Stilyagi started to disappear and fade into the rest of society. That, and also by the time this happened, the original Stilyagi would have been pushing 30, and they probably quite like to live a normal life by now. Stilyagi had a massive influence on everything that came after it. Bone music was eventually superseded by Nasties, which was essentially a network of tape copying, which was used by many of the big bands of the late period of the Soviet Union, like Nautilus Pompilus, Mumi Troll, and Kino. Every so often there's a bit of a revival in the fashion too, much like how we take the mod chic here in England every couple of decades and try and bring it back. Also about 10 years ago there was a jukebox musical about the whole thing. I've not seen it, but apparently it's really good. To close, people end up being a bit rude about fashion and young people fashion. But sometimes youth fashion can really mean things. Or it can mean nothing. Or it can mean something that pretends to mean nothing, but actually inadvertently means something. I've run out of things to say now, so let's put that picture of the sunglasses guy back up. Today I'm talking about a particularly egregious thing. Something that actually annoys me that's still going on now. George Lucas's seemingly unending quest to ruin the original Star Wars. What am I even talking about? Well, in 1977, there was this film that everyone expected to be a complete disaster that came out, and its name was Star Wars. It was this idea of some weird guy who'd written this actually quite good science fiction film a few years before. He wanted to make some like Flash Gordon fan fiction or something, but when they wouldn't let him, he just went and did this. To me, that immediately sounds great, but everyone in it and working on it and funding it thought it was going to be a big load of shit. When they filmed it in the deserts of Tunisia, people still thought it would be terrible. When they brought it back to Hollywood and George Lucas started editing it, people thought it was an incoherent mess. Looked nice, but a complete mess. And then George Lucas's wife came in, edited the film down into a workable 2-hour space opera, and the film went on to change the world as we know it today. Obviously, I might be a little bit biased in my telling of the story, but that's how I choose to see it.
I like to remember things my own way.
My point is this. George Lucas's 1977 original film, Star Wars, is a masterpiece. I don't care about the others really. I mean, there's good memes, but they're all a bit unnecessary. There's something nice about the original Star Wars. It's simple, it's self-contained, it's got good characters, a really distinctive look, and it just works as its own little film. You don't need anything else. You don't need a contrived explanation of how it all works. You don't need a forced romantic subplot. You don't need crappy CGI. You don't need Laura Dern being woefully miscast and underused. And the Oscars that year agree with me. Star Wars won the Oscars for Best Visual Effects, Best Production Design, and Best Original Score, all of which I think are completely deserved. Best Picture though, well, even now I'd still rather watch Annie Hall.
We use a large vibrating egg.
Large vibrating egg. Well, I ask a psychopath, I get that kind of an answer.
So, why are we here? We all know what Star Wars is, at least I hope you do. Obviously you can still see Star Wars, no one's banned it, the government haven't rounded up every copy of it or anything like that. I mean, you can just buy it on DVD, put it in the drive, and no! That's not f***ing Star Wars! No. That's the special edition. These are changed, re-edited versions of the original classic, spoiled for no reason. Now, it's no secret that George Lucas, even back before Phantom Menace when people trusted him with his own ideas, liked to edit his films after they came out. If you look on the delightfully titled Wikipedia, you can see a rather extensive list of edits for various videos and Laserdisc releases that you could get over the years. But it all came to a head when he shat out the special edition in 1997, just in time for Star Wars' 20th birthday.
Hey, happy birthday,
Star Wars.
Hope you like crap.
What did he do that was quite as offensive as I'm making out? I mean, I'm not really angry on this show very much. I mean, there's been a couple of times, but they've been over fairly reasonable things. Why am I so annoyed about this? Simply put, I'm quite big on preserving history and making things accessible. By stopping you from seeing the original in any proper form, he's buggering up both. Lucas justified these all by saying that this was him realising his original vision, and if this was his original vision, then it's clear just how little impact he had on his own film success. Anyway, the big one. Needless CGI on every scene in the film. All the intricately detailed Oscar award-winning models just got yanked out and replaced with this orange crap, because apparently that's better now. And then there's also the pointless conversations of CGI bits of nothing. And more CG filler. All the charm of the original film is just violently sucked out, all to achieve this original vision. And these days that original vision doesn't look any better than a 90s Eurodance video. And then the famous thing happens. In the original cut of the film, there's a conversation between one of the main characters, Han Solo, and this guy called Greedo. Basically, Han Solo's ripped off this guy, Greedo's about to kill him, and then all of a sudden, under the table, Han Solo shoots him. In the original cut, that's how it turned out, but George Lucas thought that made Han Solo a bit too evil and very heartless.
Yes, I bet you have.
Minor change in the grand scheme of the universe, sure, but it completely changes how you see Han Solo. He's no longer this cool maverick who can do what he wants to get his own way. It's boring, it's not as fun. This new version of the film is basically the only high quality copy of the film that you can legally see or buy from 97 onwards. He did eventually release the film as people saw it in the theatres back in the 70s, as a bonus feature on a limited edition collection, using a really old film transfer design for Laserdisc, which meant it was all washed out, and not very clear at all. Seriously though, man, it's like, we scanned it when we ripped it in, it's like 300 pixels wide.
That's really bad.
It's really shit.
That is really bad.
Like, this is like, if you imagine a regular 16:9 screen, it's like that. It's fucking bad, and it was deliberately bad. Basically, he'd given people an option, just not a remotely watchable or usable option. It's still a much more enjoyable film though. Hardcore fans refer to this version as gout for a reason. So that whole situation is bad. Let's make it worse with some cocksure arrogance. In 1989, the US government started archiving films deemed historically important in the Library of Congress. And naturally, Star Wars was an important film. It changed pop culture when it was released, and they tried to put it in the vault. It was actually one of the first ones they tried to. The one problem is that they require original film prints from its original run. No changes or alterations. What was sent out to the theatres when it was released is what counts, and George Lucas flat out refused to give them a copy. He refused to let the original film be backed up and stored forever. He refused to let the original film that people across the world loved be celebrated. All to add some shitty CGI that was out of date the second it hit theatres. The US government finally got a copy when George Lucas sold the rights to Disney in 2015. 2015. And even then, this print is not commercially available. You can't go and buy it. You'd have to go to the Library of Congress itself in Washington DC to see the proper film as it stands. And I'm not Nick Robinson, I can't just fly out to random countries when it's convenient for one of my YouTube videos. There are several different efforts to restoring the original viewing experience of Star Wars in various different ways. The biggest, most well-known restoration is Harmy's Despecialized Edition, which for my money is the best and most faithful job. And there are some other efforts as well, like 4K77, which is a full scanning of the whole film from an original print that they found, with some touching up work and restoration stuff done. While all of this is greatly appreciated, it's sad to know that it shouldn't have to be like this. When you make something as culturally important as the original Star Wars, you flat out shouldn't be able to withhold it in the way that George Lucas did. And you certainly shouldn't be able to doodle on it with your magic box of computer-generated lies. To George Lucas, a film has become a verb on the internet film scene, and for good reason. Whenever a filmmaker or author or whatever takes their original work, improves it, and then deprives people of the original, you might as well just not let anyone see it at all. Give people the choice of seeing it all, and if it's better, let them see both. All in all, for a man that's made a film called American Graffiti, he's damn well intent on vandalising American cinematic legacy all by himself. Even if you've never heard the term before, you're probably familiar with the concept of a blind item. Essentially, a blind item is a nudge and wink exposé of someone printed without an attribution and usually without names. You get them in newspapers, gossip rags, and is essentially what every Crush Ninja page turns into. But where did it start and why? Welcome to the tale of Town Topics. All the way back in 1879, a society journal called American Queen hit New York magazine shelves. It was a high society guide that showed and detailed some of what the best connected and upper classes of New York did best. If you imagine the descriptions of places in Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence in a weekly publication, you'll be right on the money. It was far from the first socialite magazine in New York, and as a result it didn't really sell very well. Then, all of a sudden, tragedy struck. The original owner of the paper leaves the state in dramatic fashion. After bouncing about a few different owners, it arrived in the hands of the Mann brothers. American Queen was too stuffy and too stupid to be a magazine name, they thought, and it quickly became Town Topics. A lot of the old content it was known for at the time stayed, but a few new additions creeped in. Most importantly, the gossip column that terrified New York's well-to-do and richest. So how could such a gossip column exist?
Your enunciation sucks!
For a start, US libel law is actually a lot more liberal than in the UK. I know, weird. The burden of proof in court is on the plaintiff proving it's false, and not the defendant proving it's true. This even now leads to a lot of loopholes, where UK publications can publish stuff provided it's in the US papers that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But the things that Town Topics printed weren't lies. They were just damaging scandal stories that would be very hard to prove in a courtroom. What the Mann brothers did instead was set up a ring of agents who would feed them back all the information that they wanted. From servants to musicians, dancers to waitresses, and of course bog standard private investigators. Anything they heard would eventually be passed back to the Mann brothers, and eventually they would make their way into Town Topics. So, here's what they set out to do. They'd find a story that may or may not be true, though at this point they had their own little Securitat after only a few families, their hit rate was quite high, and they'd set out on printing it. Then, for some reason, they'd actually inform the person they've dug dirt on that they've dug the dirt. From here, they'd give them an option. Either they let the story be printed, or they buy, conveniently, a one-time advert about how great they are in Town Topics. From there, the story was buried and everyone moved on with their lives, except Town Topics, who printed the story on the opposite page just without any names. So yeah, basically blackmail, but not technically blackmail. They had a few different styles of doing this too, one of the other ones being laid out like this. In the Salt Rings column, the name they gave to this bit of the paper, they'd put all the terrible things they'd found out with no names given whatsoever, which is how blind item pieces look today. But then just below that, they'd put a little unrelated paragraph specifically about someone. Doesn't really take up much effort to work out who's done what, and people at the time worked out the formula pretty quickly. And practically everything published in it was highbrow trysts and adultery. It even got an obscenity charge allotted at it, which the brothers managed to narrowly avoid. Though it did mean one of the brothers had to leave the operation, leaving just Colonel William Mann in charge. And they kept this going for well over a decade. It seemed like nothing was going to stop them. It was both feared by the nouveau riche establishment and loved by it at the same time, though in a very clandestine way, like you wouldn't want to be caught reading it. As long as you hadn't done anything wrong, it was a good insightful glimpse into how the same half live. But then things came slightly crashing down, and it largely hinged on just one woman, and her shitty adulterous husband. Emily Post, socialite, author, and professional woman. Her husband Edwin had not been particularly faithful. He'd been sleeping around with basically anyone, and eventually he received a call from one of Mann's men in the field. And allegedly he couldn't afford to pay, so instead he did something else. He immediately told his wife, set up a sting with the police, and got Mann's man arrested. And from here, the cats came out of the bag, and the secret was revealed. What they had done was now also found to be likely illegal, so a lot of lawsuits from former blackmailed social elites came about as well. Emily and Edwin Post promptly divorced. I mean, he sounds like a right catch, I don't know why she'd want to get rid of him. The paper continued going, even though it had very much peaked. In fact, it limped along in some form or another for another 25 years. By the late 1930s, it was out of print and gone for good, as were a lot of the types of socialites who clinged to the paper's bylines. And from there, Town Topics had faded away for good. This is believed to be an early example, or the outright creator, of blind item pieces, which is where a gossip report will have a full-on story that can be expository or damaging, but without any names in. Though the format was likely used somewhere before, it brought that kind of reporting to the masses, and we have Town Topics to thank for everything that came after it. A little while ago, I talked about the Stilyagi, this group of post-war Soviet teens who loved jazz and hated repression. This time we're going to talk about one of the things that they used to get their naughty books and banned records across the Soviet Union. Welcome to the interesting tale of Samizdat. Samizdat? One of the ones. Samizdat, which roughly translates to self-printing, is just that. Essentially, someone would take a book banned by the authorities, somehow make a copy of it and distribute it one way or another. The quality was low, it wasn't easy to come by, and if you were caught, have fun in Russian prison. But it worked. It connected people unhappy with the falling apart status quo of the Soviet Union together, allowing these people to appreciate some bits of Western culture the Eastern Bloc governments didn't want people seeing. It was more than just translations though, as eventually it led to an underground culture of sharing information. Some of you might know about fanzines, which are these little indie magazines you used to get before the internet. Well, if you imagine that, but even knowing about it could get you into a lot of trouble, that's your average Samizdat publication, of which there were many. From publications giving Russian Jews hope of making Alia, to anti-establishment reporting on Soviet corruption, to even getting Russian writers who couldn't get their works published the normal way out to the masses, the system of Samizdat opened minds. Though the circulation was admittedly quite small and mostly just Soviet academics, it was still way better than nothing. And while I keep saying Soviet Union in the video, it's important to note that Samizdat was commonplace in pretty much every Eastern Bloc country, like Czechoslovakia and Poland. Now, obviously, the KGB weren't that happy about this kind of thing existing. Way before people even had a chance to think of something like Samizdat, they'd started something rather scary. For example, every single Soviet typewriter and printer printed slightly differently, enough so that the KGB could take a writing sample and store it somewhere, allowing them to work out exactly where it came from. Today, having fingerprints like that are everywhere. Your printer, for example, prints these tiny little dots onto every page to help Interpol find counterfeiters, but it's not really the sort of thing you would expect from the 40s. Now, there was a big hole in this scheme. Sure, you could easily trace Joe Bloggs or Imurek back to his typewriter if it was made in Russia, but if, let's say, he bought it abroad or worse, had smuggled it in from the West, the plan wouldn't work. A lot of the more professional Samizdat writers did this, along with some other creative measures to make the process a little bit easier, like typing on a couple of bits of carbon paper so they would have multiple copies of their writing. From hiding their publications and other books, to hooking up their copying jobs to Soviet mainframe computers and deleting the trail of info, the people, not the government that allegedly represents the people, began to build quite the robust system of sharing information. And as I alluded to before, it wasn't just one type of media being sent out to the people. All sorts of books and magazines got published through Samizdat. Unfortunately, a lot of them have now been lost to history, but what does still exist is still quite interesting. For example, the Chronicle of Current Events. Published for almost 20 years, this magazine detailed the many human rights abuses conducted by the Soviet Union with surprising accuracy. And there are dozens of literary magazines that existed in the ether as well, delivering poetry and novellas to the public the Soviet system just didn't want out there. Pretty much everything you could think of got published somehow through Samizdat. Religion, which was heavily repressed or banned during the Soviet Union, was free to exist in the Samizdat world, so Christian texts, pro-Russian Orthodox pamphlets, and Jewish publications existed during this time. Lots of political stuff, some pro-democracy, some pro-liberal, some conservative, some pro-Soviet as well. Bit weird. And of course a fair amount of erotica. Soviet writers at the time of Samizdat likened it to a vice like binge drinking. Once you started, you couldn't stop, and there was just so much variety to choose from. Of course, it wasn't perfect by any means. You know when you send a picture to someone and it looks a bit crap, and then they send it to someone else, and then they send it to someone, and just, blurry mess. Samizdat was infamous for this. It was blurry, poor quality, and hard to read. But it was the only option, and people couldn't really get too fussy. An anecdote I read in a paper about Samizdat suggested that many people's reading of important anti-Soviet texts, like the Gulag Archipelago, were made all the more poignant by the tremendously bad reading experience. I mean, after all, a good government wouldn't let you read it like that, would they? And of course, if people are typing it up on their own and making copies of copies, just imagine the sheer amount of typos and mistranslations from one copy to another. And of course, the amount of people that are cutting stuff out to save time. There's a lot of anecdotes that suggest that translators didn't bother translating whole passages either because it was too long, or simply because they didn't like it. Authors also tended to get their work misattributed or misspelled or worse. And of course, the KGB definitely did do stuff to writers that they caught. Much like the bone record distributors we discussed in the Stilyagi show, the Soviet government loved to round up and arrest anyone involved in Samizdat, dishing out long prison sentences in return. The most famous case of the Union punishing Samizdat writers was the Trial of the Four. Poet Yuri Galanskov, publisher Alexander Ginsberg, writer Alexei Dobrovolsky, and typist Vera Lakova were arrested by the Soviet Union for creating Samizdat. In what can only be loosely described as a trial, the four were found guilty and sent to prison, with their defence lawyers also being barred from practising law again. Eventually, by the late 80s though, it started to not be necessary anymore. Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost era ended the need for printing books underground, and by 1991, almost all the big publications had folded. Today, this sort of smuggled information is a lot easier with computers. The concept of transferring stuff by memory stick, or sneakernet, is commonplace in repressive regimes today, like in North Korea and with Cuba's Paquet Salmonelle project. Reading about both has made me realise that there could be a good episode in that too, so subscribe for that. And of course in Russia today, people are free to access the media in any which way they choose, as long as the government okays it, and the FSB. Good to see that times haven't really changed that much. Back in the Dark Ages, when gay sex was banned, the 50s, there needed to be a safe way for gay men to communicate with each other without fear of the law or people bashing them. And it would be very helpful if it just so happened to include phrases you immediately want to add into English. Welcome to the fantabulosa world of Polari. Now, when most people talk about the history of Polari, especially when they're presenting it as second-hand information, they tend to go back to the gay culture of the 30s and 40s and not really any further back. Might not come as a surprise, but this isn't a particularly accurate way of looking at things. And to talk about it as if it was one set of words that everyone understood and everyone knew is also a little bit misleading too. Even calling it a language, which a lot of people do, might not be entirely right. And I realise I've gone way too long without actually showing you any, so here's some Polari.
Latte, bona latte, as the regular Omi from Omi. Yeah. Omi from Omi, wasn't it? Yes, it was.
Varda, Mistress Bona.
Varda the Omi Palone.
A tart, my dears, a tart in gildy clobber.
Yes, this latte, tall and stout, keeping all nath Omis out.
The consensus understanding of what Polari really is a mixture of words and phrases predominantly used by men who have sex with men. Its origins have been traced back to both the thieves' cant of the 16th century and the travelling Romani showman of the 1700s. From there it's grown and grown. It's added all these tiny little bits of every little migrant group to London. Bits of Yiddish, bits of Romani gypsy, bits of Cockney rhyming slang, and of course bits of Italian, which is where it gets its name from. There's an Italian dialect used by travelling showmen around the turn of the 19th century, commonly referred to as Polari. A lot of early literature on Polari tends to confuse the two, and while it's true that Polari's future vocabulary is very much influenced by Polari, they aren't really the same. To call Polari a dialect of Italian is extremely misleading. When you look at it on paper, it's very much English grammar with new words. To me anyway, it reminds me of Nadsat when written down. Polari, if you spell it slightly differently, also resembles the Romance language's cognate of parl, to talk. This is something that wasn't lost on Polari speakers, as the Polari phrase for telephone was indeed the Polari pipe, talking pipe. One of the most prominent voices in Polari research today, Paul Baker, described it like this. Polari speakers developed their language as a result of mingling with these transient communities, and mingle they did, if you catch my drift. As you can imagine, it wasn't written down at the time, and having it written down would serve no purpose to the speaker. The reason that Polari became used was to protect its speakers, and to also help its speakers find other speakers. Having it written down or recorded or anything would serve no purpose. It has the potential to actually do a lot of harm. It's for this reason that Baker describes Polari as an anti-language that serves its speakers by excluding others from understanding it, and when looking at individual words that becomes increasingly apparent. As well as the usual slang, there's a lot of reversing of English words. For example, hair becomes rear, and face becomes ekath, shortened to eek, as in,
Oh, it's Bona to Varda, your dolly oldie.
Who are you?
There's something imaginative and guttural and funny about Polari words, and a lot of the best slang in the gay world understandably comes directly from Polari, like fruit or camp or butch or cottaging or love trade. All of these are Polari words that have entered the English language from Polari. Interestingly though, cruising and rent boy aren't. I know, right? I just assumed they would be. Yes, there are plenty of other non-gay, non-sex terms that also come from Polari.
The future could be naff, or it could be Bona. The time has come for a frank and honest Varda at our awkward position.
Oh, yes.
And with our eeks shining with hope, stroll together towards the fantabulosa futurette.
At its peak, it was the lingua franca for gay people around England. Plenty of people spoke it, there were different dialects depending on where you live. Young gay men would usually get taught it by older gay men who introduced them to the scene, and this new wave of youthfulness also brought it into contact with a lot of new words. Specifically words coming from America and the emerging 60s counterculture. It did truly reach far and wide, from the seas on the merchant navy to the theatrical world, stagehands and performers. and they say stereotypes about us don't exist for a reason. But by the 60s it was becoming a little bit out of date. This is when it also became a bit more public as well. The Julian and Sandy sketch on the radio show Round the Horn brought Polari to the masses, and people were presented for the first time, really ever, with this bawdy, shocking, hilarious way of talking.
We had a little latte up an alley off Order Street, called ourselves Boner Prods.
Excuse me, Boner Prods. That doesn't have a second meaning, does it?
I don't think it has a first meaning.
But by the time Round the Horn had finished its run, being gay was legal in England, so it didn't really need to exist anymore. Its speakers very much dropped out of it, and no one was picking it up anymore. However, there was an interest in keeping what did exist of it written down. Around 20 years ago, there was a big boom in making sure everything was preserved.
And a lot of that was down to one linguist, Paul Baker. His work on Polari is responsible for getting some of the more obscure slang written down. Here's a clip of an interview he did for Sydney Gay Pride on why he chose to study it.
I found it quite interesting that there was this whole language which was known in the 1960s, but a few decades later it seems to have been completely gone. And I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it would be fascinating to try to find out more about it, and also to sort of keep a record of it, make a record of it, so that it wouldn't be lost altogether. I was very much aware that the people who spoke it were getting older, they were in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and if somebody didn't take the time to actually go and talk to them and get their side of the story, find out about it, they would die and it would be too late. And actually, while I was doing my research and interviewing men, sometimes it felt a bit like a race against time. In fact, one or two speakers actually did die a few weeks after I spoke to them, so I really felt as if I had to get a move on and get this done quickly.
And as well as work done by him and various others, some of its best words, as I said before, have actually entered the English language in a more mainstream way. So as well as its heritage being kept alive, its vocabulary is as well.
Today, Polari enjoys a bit of an artistic renaissance, with the occasional poem, song or student film being written in it.
Irish multi-palaver. Pauline told her to shove a cycle up a Khyber.
She didn't say that.
Mate, wee ducky wee in your actual English.
So while Polari may no longer need to be used, it certainly hasn't been forgotten. Though, let's just hope we'll never need to use it again. These days, sex scandals are 10 a penny. Seemingly every politician you can think of is doing drugs, using rent boys, or both. But this grand British tradition had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was in the flat of John Profumo. The Profumo scandal is hard to summarise. Essentially, it's a big web of infidelity, Cold War intrigue, and idiocy. But there's way more to it than that, so let's start at the beginning with a woman called Christine Keeler. Christine Keeler's life was really horrible. Too horrible to really talk about in any great detail on a show as light-hearted as this. In short, she was pushed about and taken advantage of by pretty much every man she came across. By age 17, she was working as a part-time model and full-time topless showgirl in Soho. Understandably, through this line of work, she met a lot of men, the most pivotal of which being a socialite doctor called Stephen Ward. Ward was an interesting fellow. While he was known for his medical work, he was just as well known for being a fantastic portrait artist. He treated the rich and famous elite of the world, from Gandhi to Sinatra, and had drawn a fair amount of them too. He was well known and well liked, and he grew attached to Keeler, and the two started living together. Abetted by the head of the Daily Telegraph at the time, Ward made it his mission to draw the Soviet High Command. Naturally, doing this as a British-American citizen is going to require some inside vouching. So naturally, he had to find the right person at the Russian embassy to let him in, so to speak. And that person was Eugene Ivanov, a person so obscure that there's only one picture on Google Images of him, and I don't have the rights to it. We're just going to have to deal with the silhouette for now, I think, until I can think of something better. Ivanov was a Russian embassy attaché with ambitions. The Soviets asked him to penetrate high society in England, and he did just that, largely thanks to Ward. In the midst of all this, Ivanov found time in his schedule to, go out with Christine Keeler like everyone else. It didn't last, though. A few months later, Ward and Keeler would go to a private party, and in that party, whilst Ivanov and Ward were talking about the potential of US missiles being planted in West Germany, Keeler found Profumo. So who was this Profumo bloke when he's at home, or at Christine Keeler's flat? Lord John Profumo was a Conservative MP, senior cabinet minister and hereditary peer. He was a member of the British elite. Profumo was well respected, came from inherited wealth and was generally well liked. Their affair was, as described by many, passionate, intense. but extremely short and really of no consequence. There was no real salacious detail or interesting story. It was your average, scarily well-planned affair, I'm afraid. Any real anecdotes to share? Not really. The best one in the book is her cooking sausages before they do it. I mean, that's it. There's actually better anecdotes from Keeler about Ivanov, who she described as having, quote, an extremely hairy chest. And based on that, that silhouette is out and Zangief from Street Fighter is in. Anyway, life moves on. By the end of '62, Profumo and Keeler had fizzled out, Keeler wasn't really seeing Ward or Ivanov anymore, and she was living with a jazz promoter called Johnny Edgecombe. Even though this was the case, and everything had ended, there was an aura of suspicion around Ward, Ivanov, and also rumours about a government minister having it off with Keeler as well. It wasn't quite an open secret, but people had their inklings. There was nothing, however, hard to go on. There was also no catalyst for it to reach the masses as well. So, it could be forgotten about, and no one would ever know the truth. Then one day, Johnny Edgecombe decides to knife one of Christine Keeler's ex-boyfriends in a Soho nightclub. Christine Keeler, understandably, not a big fan of this, so she decides to break it off with Edgecombe. She also drops in that she's also going to testify against him in the now inevitable court trial about the knifing. Edgecombe decides that the rational response to being told this is to go outside Ward's flat, where Christine Keeler's hiding, and open fire with a stolen handgun. So, now, there's 2 trials involving Keeler, and one also now involving Ward. Oh dear. Keeler decides at this point that it'd be a fantastic idea to tell pretty much everyone that's ever lived every sordid detail about the whole affair. She also decides to sell her story to the presses. But before anyone can hit print, Ward and Profumo quite literally stop the presses.
The UK has some of the strictest libel laws in the world. Because the papers couldn't prove the rumours, they could be bullied into submission by Profumo's lawyers.
A few months have passed, Ivanov has been recalled by the Soviet Union, and the Johnny Edgecombe trials are about to start. One problem? Their key witness, a certain Christine Keeler, has run the country, which is very, very illegal. Edgecombe still went to prison, mind you. I mean, there are other witnesses, and it was pretty obvious he stabbed someone, but it did draw national attention to it, though the papers couldn't quite report on it yet because it had unconfirmable details.
Then one day, that all changed.
On the 21st of March 1963, Labour MP George Wigg gave a short speech to Parliament. Thanks to a thing called parliamentary privilege, defamation laws don't apply in the House. So, he could mention the Edgecombe shooting, he could mention Christine Keeler, he could mention Profumo, and everything else. Profumo spent the last couple of months trying to hide his incompetency and adultery, and had it smattered down in about 2 minutes. The next day, Profumo issued this statement to the House, and I'd like to remind you that lying to the House is a very, very serious crime. Or at least it was. I met Miss Keeler on about a dozen occasions when I called to see Ward and his friends. Miss Keeler and I were on friendly terms. There was no impropriety whatsoever in my acquaintanceship with Miss Keeler. Remind you of anyone?
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Around this time, a formal investigation into Stephen Ward's national security risks had also started too, during which Christine Keeler told the police everything. Ward retaliated by sending lots of letters to anything vaguely government-shaped, including the leader of the opposition at the time, Harold Wilson. He now was saying that he was bullied into submission by Profumo.
Shortly after sending these letters, he was then arrested for living off the immoral earnings of prostitutes. A lot of later writers have suggested that this was a setup to publicly disgrace him, along with the accusations that he was a Russian spy. Unfortunately, these all worked, and Ward killed himself in August 1963.
For Profumo, though, the scandal was still heating up, and the Tory party had started their own investigation into his affairs. Whilst on holiday with his wife and kids, he was summoned back to London, and at that moment he realised he was in too deep and confessed everything. He resigned from political office pretty much immediately. The scandal that followed dragged on for years. As late as 1969, almost 6 years after the scandal had started, the News of the World was still paying Christine Keeler for new memoirs. Keeler was still revealing bits of the scandal as late as 2001.
Though these later allegations are widely believed to be false. So, with that in mind, 50 years later, what happened to everyone?
After the scandal, Profumo decided to volunteer at Toynbee Hall and lived off his inherited wealth, an option that Keeler, Ivanov and everyone else in the story obviously didn't have. Edgecombe didn't really do anything important after he came out of prison,
and Ivanov, according to Russian Wikipedia, was found dead sometime in the mid-90s.
When I decided to do this episode, I thought it was going to be a lot funnier, to be honest. Like Jeffrey Archer or Angus Dayton or Keith Vaz, funny scandals. So I was quite disappointed when I started reading the books that it's actually fairly non-eventful.
Bear in mind, this is just a summary of what happened. If you want a more detailed understanding of it, I recommend reading the books that I've cited.
It's unlike every sex scandal after it, given how little actually happened that was sex.
This scandal did change how we viewed politicians forever. Before this, surprisingly, people used to look up to them. Whilst as nowadays, if this sort of thing happens, it's just white noise, as most of us have grown to find politicians both contemptuous and arguably flawed regular human beings rather than crown-appointed deities.
I actually feel quite sorry for Christine Keeler. I mean, sure, she did milk the situation, but wouldn't you? If you had no money, no standing in society, and a history of being routinely exploited by horrible, abusive and manipulative men, wouldn't you do the same? I know I would. Well, except sleep with John Profumo, obviously. I mean, he might have been a great man, as she put it, but come on, he looks like a melted waxwork of himself. Well, it's not like he can sue now, is it? So, in the Video Nasties episode, I mentioned the Obscene Publications Act, a law that we have here in the United Kingdom. It allows the government to both take away works deemed to be obscene and prosecute those who distribute it. Today's usage of it is fairly reasonable. Unfortunately, there does have to be limits to expression, especially when it comes to children, animals or terrorism. Sure, there's some things that are a bit strange. For example, a rather famous shock video that you were definitely shown by your mates at school is 100% illegal to watch, let alone have. And based on a debate in the House of Commons, having still images of films like Hostel could be constituted as owning extreme images. To my knowledge, no one's been arrested for either, yet, but it's still very, very possible. But it's not completely ridiculous anymore. In fairness to us, we've come a very long way in a very short amount of time. And we pretty much have just one book to thank for it. Lady Chatterley's Lover, and the obscenity trial that followed. So, let's start in the 20s, and no, I'm not going to do the black and white filter thing again, that joke's a bit old hat now. Literature was heading in an all-new direction. All the established conventions of storytelling were being turned on their head, or in some cases completely thrown out of the window. This is when writers like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, E.E. Cummings, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Daphne du Maurier, and countless others were writing some of their best works. This was the boom of modernist literature. Ideas like moral ambiguity, questioning of authority, stream of consciousness writing, and crucially button-pushing content became very, very mainstream. One of those modernist writers was D.H. Lawrence, who in 1927 wrote his last book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And for those who know nothing about it at all, allow me to briefly summarise the story, with the tact the story has for its events. Once upon a time, there's a rich woman who's pent up and not getting any. She has an irritating, disabled husband who spends his time complaining about modern life. She then meets a working-class gamekeeper who's also not getting any. As D.H. Lawrence would describe in the book, they fuck. The hand gesture really makes it, and then they go and complain about modern life together. There's a few details I'm missing, obviously. Naturally, the contents of this book was a bit ripe for some, and by some I mean the entire English-speaking world. It was quite heavily censored upon its original release in Great Britain and the US. The French and Italians, meanwhile, obviously didn't care about that sort of thing, and it got printed uncut. It would take over 30 years for someone to try and publish an uncut Chatterley here in the UK. And who were the literary heroes that decided to do that? Well, Penguin. Penguin, known for publishing those little paperbacks and basically allowed anyone from society to read a book, decided to publish Lady Chatterley Unabridged in August 1960. I have the original 1960 copy right here. It sold for 3 and 6 in old money, which is about £5 today, and on the surface it looks like any other Penguin book. I've got another one for comparison, obviously much newer. It's not being sold by some sort of horny Penguin spin-off, it's being treated like an actual book, because it is an actual book. And recently to its publishing, that Obscene Publications Act thing we mentioned had a new bit added onto it explicitly protecting explicit literature. A couple of months after it was published, Penguin was prosecuted for publishing it. I've got another book as well, but I can't really show you the cover. Not because it's rude, but because it's green, so we'll have to do a cutaway. Penguin actually published a book detailing the trial, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about from this point onwards are in that book. To be honest with you, I think the trial book is actually better than Lady Chatterley's Lover. It just showed how hilariously out of touch the born-to-rule tough establishment of the time really were with literature. Seriously, it was such a relief finding out how hilarious the trial was after the Profumo episode. The defence cited the book as being able to deprave and corrupt the reader. God, where have we heard that before? That Lady Chatterley was not in the public good to have easily available, and even though Lawrence was a respected writer with a massive back catalogue, its dirtiness invalidated that. Probably the most famous quote from the case came from Mr. John Mervyn. Guthrie. Griffith Jones. CBEMC. Yeah, I think based on that you can tell he's part of the prosecution.
Is this a book you'd have lying around your own house? A book you'd let your sons and daughters read? Because girls can read as well as boys. Is it a book you'd wish even your wife or servants to read?
God, you ever read something and you have no idea where to start? It's sort of ironic that his wife sounds like she's trapped in a similarly sexless predicament to the one the First Lady Chatterley finds herself in. I just hope she was able to find her mellors. On trial as well, seemingly, was D.H. Lawrence's use of repetition. Not once, but on 3 separate occasions I clocked in the transcript, they complain that he repeats words too much. If I pick a random section from this book, I'm bound to find a bit where they're complaining about how he's using the same words. I am asking, do you regard that as good writing to repeat again womb and bowels, bowels and womb? Is that what you call expert artistic writing? This also crosses paths as well with their issues with some of the 4-letter words used, and there's a good bit where the defence had to explain to the judge how people would be aware of its uses in wider society, and this is a direct quote.
50 yards from this court this morning, I heard a man say fuck 3 times as he passed me. He was speaking to himself, and he said, fuck it, fuck it, fuck it, as he walked past.
Followed by, and I think this is my favourite line in the whole thing, if you've worked on a building site, you will find fuck recurs over and over again. Also of note is the section where the judge suggested that based on the cheap price of the book, people wouldn't be able to appreciate its literary merit or understand that swear words exist. No, seriously. Griffith Jones, the counsel that I've mentioned already, was simply, and fairly put, a complete cretin. There's a bit where he chastises someone for quoting the Bible wrong and then proceeds to do the same thing himself. And rather hilariously, he ends up saying fucking cunt way more in this trial than they are actually said in the book that he's complaining about. I'm skimming over, there are plenty of other details in this book that I've had to leave out because otherwise this video would be 20 minutes of me laughing at stupid establishment types. Seriously, if you can pick a copy of this up on eBay, I really recommend it because it's bloody funny. Best comedy book of the 60s, hands down. Thankfully, at this trial, dozens of writers, literary experts, sociologists, and this is the one that surprised me, vicars were on hand ready to defend Britain from censorship. The transcripts of the court give tons and tons of great examples of people both defending work that they agree with and defending people's right to express an opinion, even if they think it's invalid.
However, the defence still had the odds against them. Reading it, it feels like the judge definitely sides with the prosecution.
Part of which seems to stem from Lawrence's apparent advocating of a criminal act in the passage of the book involving the back passage. Anal was actually illegal for straight people until the late 90s. But thankfully, in this case, sanity prevailed. There was a jury of 9 not angry men and 3 women. Girls can read as well as boys, after all. They came back with a unanimous not guilty vote, and thanks to the common law system we have, what the police could and couldn't prosecute was forever changed. From then on, an obscenity charge for writing something that may offend was not only less likely, but if it was prosecuted, it was way, way less likely to be charged and convicted. The common law was now on your side, for the first time ever. I mean, granted, there were still cases where prosecutions did happen. There was the Fanny Hill one later in the 60s, where we banned a 200-year-old book because it had spanking in it. seriously, we did that. And of course the video nasties thing that we've discussed before. I can't understate how much this both opened up avenues of expression for everyday people and authors and publishers alike. It also got people to think about the government that was ruling them at the time. The defence was laughably, indefensibly out of touch, and the concept of banning a book because it contains something every single person alive is a product of seemed really, really stupid. Today, thankfully, we can print pretty much anything, but every once in a while it's important to remind ourselves of what life was like before we could, and how we can laugh at it.
You know, the film censorship people here in Britain have had a rather weird history. I mean, we've talked a little bit about how they've lobbied the government in the past, but we've not really talked about the stuff they were doing before, during and after that point. As late as the 1980s and 90s, they were still cutting nunchucks out of films. And surprisingly, a lot of their crazy ideas were down to just one guy, the Tsar of British censors, James Ferman. But was he as completely stupid and ridiculously evil as I always make out on this show? Yes! Ferman was born in America in 1935, and after joining the US Air Force, ended up staying in England permanently. At a sprightly 40 years old, he got the job that every kid dreams of, being the head of the British Board of Film Censors. And he came in at a time of great change. The 1970s. America had given up on its crazy Hays Code moralism, and now people could drink, dance and screw in their films. And do all three at the same time they probably did. Europe, as always so, was on another level. Whether it's Italian horrors, Swedish sex comedies or French art films about shitting yourself and dying, we'd beaten them to the punch. You know, with all the good things you want in life. Also in England we had quite an important movie-making renaissance of our own. Films like The Wicker Man, The Devils, Quadrophenia, Kess, Performance, and countless others changed how directors directed. But whilst filmmakers were trying these new things, the BBFC would rather they didn't. Now, while they did change a fair bit in the 70s, they didn't really want to budge too much. But to begin with at least, Ferman was going to be different. To begin with, here's a quick quote from former censor Geoffrey Wood all about Ferman.
When James Ferman was appointed censor in 1975, he brought new standards of viewing and reporting to the board. But by the mid-1980s, it was stuck in an unfinished revolution. Backed by a newly appointed presidential troika, the director's word became law. Ferman could do what he liked.
And what Ferman grew to like was to protect people from danger. That's right, people, the danger of films! He believed that violence and sex-heavy content was not suitable for the general public, because they will inevitably be desensitised to it, and therefore go out and copy what they've seen. He was a big pusher of legislation following the Video Nasties debate. So when the Video Recordings Act came in, all films had to be rated by his film board, and by 1985, store shelves only had rated videos. Naturally, almost every video nasty on that big list, that I in fairness did try to show you, it's just the video effects didn't really go very well, was either summarily banned or heavily cut. We're talking cuts to sex, violence, language, you name it, and him and his film board did it. And to tons of films that really didn't deserve it, as you'll see in a minute. For example, Ferman hated The Exorcist. From 1986, you couldn't buy a copy of it because Ferman wouldn't let it get cleared for a home video release. I just want to clarify, not the board, but Ferman specifically.
So The Exorcist, the board had to have a look at it and had to decide on how to classify it for video release. But it was seen several times by pretty much all the board's examiners. I think it's fair to say a majority of people felt it should be past 18 uncut, as had happened with the cinema release. However, there was a minority view, and our director James Ferman was part of that were concerned really that because the film had this aura of notoriety, it would tend to attract younger people, coupled with the fact that the protagonist is a 12-year-old girl, that this might make younger children more interested in The Exorcist than they might be in other adult-level films, and there was therefore a risk that the film might particularly appeal to children and they might seek it out. So ultimately the deadline came round in 1988 and the board decided to just put the film on ice.
Not give it a certificate.
We didn't reject it, but we didn't give it a certificate.
Yeah, but to the public, both end up with the same result. A technicality is not going to stop you from the reality that you censored art.
And you want to know how long it took for The Exorcist to finally come out on video? February 1999. According to pro-lifers, and probably Ferman, let's be real, I was alive at a time where you couldn't buy The Exorcist.
If you're older than me, you might remember these 4 things being named for Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. There must have been a reason for that, right? We just don't know anything about Japan. No, mostly James Ferman. Ferman, and therefore the BBFC as well, hated nunchucks, both real ones and cartoon ones. Ferman was concerned that people would be inspired by their usage in martial arts films and then go out onto the streets and kill people with them, because that's what will cause an uptick in violence. Not the rampant socioeconomic problems of the 80s, not the miners' strikes, not the troubles, but a bit of wood that you're more likely to hurt yourself with. Of course, if Ferman had cared to go to his local newsagents, he would have found tons of martial arts magazines with back pages full of nunchuck selling action. Almost as if they still existed, even if the films he cut pretended they didn't. There are many, many detailed frame-by-frame breakdowns of the edits the BBFC instilled on Enter the Dragon or the Ninja Turtles films, and they're all an eye-opener for just how seriously, / stupidly, they took this whole banning parts of martial arts thing. But as I said, it wasn't just for Ninja Turtles. The Bruce Lee catalogue and practically any martial art film of the time got some serious pruning and trimming. And speaking of things affected by serious trimming after the 70s,
what is bizarre and fascinating about James Ferman was his view of art. Infamously, he once said that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was fine for middle-class cineasts, but what would happen if you let a worker from Manchester see it? When it came to mainstream schlock, he censored a lot of dumb stuff. But art, with the one exception of blasphemy, was usually fine. Especially towards the end of his career, he really let art films push the envelope, for example The Idiots, which got away with full, unsimulated sex scenes. In brief, he was a massive, massive snob. Eventually, things came to an end. After nearly 25 years, he resigned in 1999. In a rather strange way, he'd actually tried to reverse some of the really crazy stuff that he'd started. It was almost as if he had a bit of an epiphany, typically as he was about to leave the job.
And an actual era of change and demystifying occurred, so quickly that his terrible legacy on cinema was pretty much wiped out in a couple of years. The BBFC created and published guidelines for the first time with direct consultation from the public that it represents. And now we're pretty much censorship free. Well, within reason obviously, but it's not the hell that it used to be, and at the very least you can watch The Exorcist in the comfort of your own home.
And it was that moment in filming when I realised I'd forgotten to buy a prop. Whoops.
When we think of 30s Hollywood, we tend to think of something fairly family-friendly. The early Disney classics, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Nothing really that offensive. Hollywood wasn't always like that. In fact, when those films had come out, Hollywood had only just cleaned up his act. When the dictatorial Hays Code was swept in, taking any sort of bad theme out of films, or making them really morally contrived and stupid. Let's go back in time, maybe a couple of years, and go into the wonderful world of the pre-code era. A perfect storm of scandals, particularly the Fatty Arbuckle murder case, very much the O.J. Simpson trial of the 20s, led Hollywood to believe that there was a bit of an issue with how its morality was being perceived. So they hired this very religious guy called Will Hays to come and mop everything up. The main thinking behind it was if they could keep the studio's output clean, the government wouldn't need to come in to do it for them. Keep in mind, this was back when government intervention was hated by everyone. Hays proposed the formula, a set of rules that the studios could abide by in order to mop up their films and keep things fairly PG, though the term PG didn't exist back then. People read it and people saw it, and no one really gave a shit. A couple of years later, 2 clergymen saw his ideas and built upon it. Hays really liked this thing that they'd built, and thus the Hays Code came into practice. Sort of. It was voluntary, the studios had to agree to doing it, and MGM in 1930 said they were going to do it. At the same time, people just didn't really care enough to do it. Even though the government intervention thing was scary to the film studios, it still wasn't enough to make them want to censor their work, and fair enough.
After all, sex sells. Even if the Puritans didn't think it was right, it did. Hollywood was exploring and developing new markets, and not having any rules to follow proved to be a great way of experimenting with what could and couldn't work.
Looking back, a lot of the pre-code films seem rather laughable to consider edgy or offensive today. I mean, by our standards today it's nothing, and compared to European films of the time, completely nothing.
But that's not to say that pre-code era didn't push the envelope. Here's just some of the best examples I can think of.
Films like Safe in Hell, Freezer Match, Female, and the still controversial Babyface brought empowered female characters to the silver screen barely 10 years after suffrage.
Ever since I was 14, what's it been? Nothing but men, dirty, rotten men, and you're lower than any of them. I'll hate you as long as I live.
And if you weren't sexing it up, you could shoot it up, like with the mobster epic and grandfather of The Godfather, Scarface.
Don't you know it's Valentine's Day?
And if these weren't honest enough depictions of the human experience, you could always criticise the powers that be, whether it's sending you to die in a war, sending you into great financial difficulties,
So a guy's money ain't safe unless it's in his sock.
They're all a bunch of crooks.
You said it.
or sending you down for something you didn't do.
His was the most sensational escape in chain gang history.
And in the cartoon world, animations weren't afraid to do what they wanted either.
You win in a minute.
Yeah, but you can see why this was banned.
All these sort of taboos for the time were just being shattered by pre-code films. All sorts of things that people didn't even want to talk about in their own homes were getting a voice on camera.
Unfortunately, the fun wouldn't last.
1934 was when Hollywood went full Hays Code. Films were immediately censored. Scripts were torn apart just to make sure that they fitted this arbitrary moral code. Everything got toned down. If your character was too promiscuous, no, it wasn't anymore. Everything had this moral slant grafted onto it afterwards, so films like Scarface just couldn't be made anymore. Politics and religion were pretty much wiped out of mainstream discourse, so films like Journey's End and All's Quiet on the Western Front probably would have been censored quite a bit. Some managed to work within the system, others unfortunately did not. It took a good long while of ingenuity and subtle jabs at the code for it to finally become completely meaningless. Eventually, by the end of the 1960s, the code's insanity had pretty much been torn down, and the modern-day MPAA was formed. Now, finally, films could be as extreme as they wanted, provided they were made by a major studio and not an independent film. Or remotely gay. At least it wasn't the government doing it. It's 1980, and as we all know, British society is on the brink of collapse. The economy's ruined, the Soviets are going to blow us up tomorrow, and practically everything else will kill you too. But there's a new moral panic that you should absolutely sacrifice everything for.
Despite the efforts of customs officers, it is inevitable that smuggled goods do get through.
Story after tragic story of the effect of this type of material.
And the more you feed people, you corrupt them and entice them to want something more hard.
Should video nasties be censored, or should they be freely available to adults and children?
That's right. The video nasty.
In the United Kingdom, the Films Rating Board, the BBFC, and the government have the power to ban films.
Films that may be objectionable, or as we call them in law, obscene. And back when people were a lot more traditional, shall we say, a lot of things got banned. Sometimes you see it and think, fair enough, I don't really want to live on a planet where spit on your grave exists too. Other times, it's the BBFC quite literally banning and editing nunchucks out of films because they thought they were a menace to society. I'm not making it up. That went on until the 90s. Anyway, I digress. 1980. The law at the time only allowed the BBFC, the film ratings people, to ban cinema films. They couldn't do anything else. However, the government had the power to seize anything that they declared obscene, under this law called the Obscene Publications Act. There's one catch-all clause in its definition of obscenity, which is defined as being able to deprave and corrupt the public. So, if your local police force think that the book you've written or the film you've rented may constitute as being obscene, well, they can arrest you, they can arrest the publisher, and the distributor.
I say arrested. You probably wouldn't be convicted. This is going to be important in a sec.
By the end of the 1970s, you started to get these video cassettes. Immediately, you could have a whole cinema's archive in your house, and then some. And they didn't have to be rated either. You could have films that would never make it into the cinema. So lots of films you wouldn't see in the cinemas started to circulate very quickly. Some films were genuinely interesting, and others were schlock and filth. Up and down the country, obscene videos were seized by local police forces. However, there were no standards. The police could just seize what they wanted.
So if your police force was a bit more trigger happy or religious than the one next door, you and your local video shop might just pay the price for it. For instance, a copy of the Dolly Parton musical The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas was rather famously seized by one police force on the assumption that it might just be pornography.
A prank letter was at one stage sent to Mary Whitehouse telling her about the horrible things that happened in a film called Cannibal Holocaust. From there, she complained so loudly that the press got involved, and immediately it became front page news and a new moral panic to kickstart the decade and distract everyone else from all the horrible stuff. Eventually this all became a complete mess, so the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time decided there needed to be some sort of order to it all. Films, if they were seized, could be successfully prosecuted. It was distributed to every police force in the country and lots of them followed it. This was the list of the video nasties. I've put the full list in a little ticker below, and the ones that are currently still banned by the BBFC I've included in red. Now, I'm going to try and be fair here, because we've got to remember this was almost 40 years ago now. Standards were different. What you expected in film was very different. And even now, being uncomfortable with some of the things in these films I think is fairly legitimate.
Within this list, you've got a fair amount of grisly body horror. It's fairly easy to defend. At the same time, you've got some pretty awful violence against women and animals, and weird, bizarre Nazi fetishism masquerading as legitimate cinema.
I can completely sympathise with people who wouldn't want these films to exist. If you truly believe that work and art can deprave and corrupt people, then why would you keep these legal? I've seen a couple of the legal ones and read a fair bit about the others, and you're not missing much. It's very hard to defend these films for a couple of reasons, but the main one is that they're not really great films. They're exploitation films, they're shock and very little else. These films are all designed to be provocative and obscene, to get a reaction out of windbags with nothing better to do than to call out they don't like degenerate. And it worked. The prosecutions list was not enough to the public. There needed to be more action. And so, in 1984, the government came up with the Video Recordings Act. Notice one of these in the corner? That became a legal requirement. In order to have your video sold anywhere in the United Kingdom, you had to get it rated in the same way that a film had to be rated. Keep in mind, this approach is not what any other Western country does, it's very much voluntary. This became a legal requirement. Films had to be rated. If you didn't rate your films, you'd get fined or go to prison. But the mooing mob importantly got what it wanted, and these annoying grannies could go back to doing what they do best.
Campaigning for the banning of literally everything that they weren't going to use in the first place. My original plan here was a rather long bit on why censorship is bad. However, as I was editing it, I realised that it's not really necessary. We all know why it's stupid, and the backlash to censors is far more mainstream than it ever was in the 80s.
Thankfully, the BBFC is fairly reasonable these days, and a video nasties crisis probably won't happen again. Unfortunately, a lot of the same laws that allowed it to happen are still on the book. There's very little we can do about the BBFC should it decide to become very authoritarian. I guess we can hope that they don't, or just make sure they don't censor the internet.
This is Grant Hudson, CKLW 2020 News.
I think it's fair to say that every news producer at some point or another is trying to zhuzh up their format in order to get people's attention. Some will try fancy different formats, others will try fancy graphics to seemingly confuse the viewer, and others will turn the news into a rather disgusting spectacle of gruesome events and gory details. This is the Big 8. It's the late 1960s. In a Canadian city called Windsor, there is a little station called the Big 8. It's on the border between Ontario and Michigan, and has a massive audience. Importantly for this story, it covered the Motor City, Detroit. They pioneered a format in the region called Boss Radio, where the pool of top hits to play was considerably smaller, and the bits of radio that took away from the music, such as the on-air personalities and jingles, were cut from minutes to seconds. In Canada at least, and I believe in the United States and definitely here as well, the government requires you to do at least a little bit of news reporting on your radio station, typically twice an hour. It doesn't say when, so the Big 8 had the fantastic idea of moving their news broadcasts 20 minutes before and 20 minutes after the hour instead. So whilst everyone else, bang on the hour, is going straight to news, The Big Eight's still playing hits. So that's all well and good, but that wasn't enough. The news had to be captivating and interesting, as important to the listener as the hits themselves. Under the direction of a man called Byron McGregor, yes, the fact that we've both got the same name is not lost on me, LOL, MDR, etc. A new format emerged on CKLW.
A gang out fishing this afternoon pulled up something they weren't planning on for dinner.
The kids were fishing in the canal over there, and they spotted something wrapped in a blanket.
It turned out to be a rotting body. Eyewitness Charles Evans tells the 2020 hotlines that stiff sank to the bottom then. That's when police were called in. The worm-baited hook belonging to Victoria Finley, who tells what that floater looked like.
Yes, that was real. And twice an hour. It was lurid.
James Mays was there. He called the law, then called the Big Eight to say it was enough to make you sick.
It was tabloid.
Picked up his genuine Willie Mays powerized lightning strike Louisville Slugger baseball bat. Proceeded to hit 1,000 on the woman's head. She's dead.
Grotesque. Obscene. Filth. But the important thing, it wasn't drivel. It was interesting. It was as interesting as the hits that were on the radio as well. Let's dissect a little bit about what's going on here, which makes it so captivating and so unique. And the more I pick it apart, the more you'll realise it's actually quite like modern news. Far more so than anything else on at the time. Remember that radio news and TV news at the time was very boring. No scintillating graphics, nothing, just news. It was there to inform the viewer and nothing else. This was there to inform and entertain. So you hear that immediately, that booming voice.
Along Military Road, about 1.5 miles from Camp Grayling.
Give this commanding cadence, along with their visceral vocabulary. It all gives it a massive sense of urgency.
That man with his beak out the back, barfing on the byway.
Wraps in a sheen of gory detail and delivered at the speed of sound. Not to mention that teletype clacking in the background.
The car got a little too close to the dump truck. The man's head slammed into the truck's bumper. 43-year-old John Kelly Jr. decapitated.
Lovely.
There's hours and hours of tapes out there on YouTube and beyond of the CKLW glory days, the 2020 news at its finest. To me, it's tasteless and morbid, but there's one important part of the pie that I'm missing here. I didn't live in 1960s Detroit.
8 murders since midnight, 3 of them happening a short time ago in an attempted quadruple blow-off.
We're missing a lot of perspective here.
At the time 2020 news started, the Detroit murder rate was at its highest in recorded history, and as the years continued, it would only increase.
I'd hedge a bet and say everyone in Detroit knew someone that had been affected by violent crime, or had been themselves. There was no detachment from it. It was becoming an extremely dangerous place to live, and a show as gaudy and yellow as 2020 may be, it understandably offers some comfort or gallows humour in the horrors of the murder city. Plus, people will do anything for money.
We pay a weekly cash award and write a check for $1,000 for the year's best story.
Like all things, it eventually came to an end. CKLW became a victim of CanCon, which is when the Canadian government forced all of its radio stations to play a certain amount of Canadian hits. Unfortunately, no one really wanted to listen to them and viewership declined. The team left and did other things. In fact, actually, a lot of the announcers did fairly well. What remained was the influence that they'd come to have on radio, both good, bad, and ugly. This, in my eyes, is a precursor to the tarting up of news we see a lot today. Gaudy, nauseating drivel designed to entertain the audience more than actually inform them.
When CKLW started their more gaudy format, they actually found themselves being ostracised from the greater news community. People didn't like where they were going.
In many ways, the news has now caught up, and everyone is like the 2020 news. Entertainment over information.